Here we go. All right, welcome. We've got with us Dr. Jacob Shively, a very good and old friend from my days at Indiana University, professor of political science at the University of West Florida. And Jacob has just come out with a new book on Trump's foreign policy, well, specifically grand strategy. And since that's a close fit to the topic that we're discussing in our class, foreign policy analysis, particularly the individual level, I thought it'd be a good idea to have a little chat about it. Jacob, in your book, you argue that your book focuses on grand strategy, and you argue that grand strategy can be best understood and categorized by the following three factors: scope, substance, and assertiveness. Can you define grand strategy and explain what those three factors mean?
Yeah, but although first of all, I'm glad I get an opportunity to talk to you and your students. I'm always curious to see what's happening in other universities and other classes, what other people are studying. Sounds like it's very similar to what I'm doing in my classes. So when it comes to grand strategy, I ended up using two different definitions. The first one is very general, and it's based mostly on the many other definitions, so it's not too innovative. But basically, I say that grand strategy is the state's plan to define and pursue its interests in the world, particularly as they relate to security. Another famous definition is by a scholar named Posen, who says, that basically it's a means-ends calculation, that any strategy is an attempt to figure out what you want to do and what are the tools available to you to then achieve that thing. So you're often within that making cost-benefit calculations. What do we have and how do we get what we want? So at a grand strategy level, when it comes to foreign policy, the idea is that policymakers are trying to maximize their goals using what's available to them. But that's still pretty vague in a lot of ways, and particularly because I think there's often a distinction between people who talk about strategy as a value, like we want good strategy, so we need to do X, Y, and Z things, and more social scientific scholars or empirical scholars who just want to understand how states behave, setting aside what is best or worst for that given state. So with that in mind, and I developed this idea of grand strategy analysis, I more precisely define what I'm looking at as a pattern of thought in policy. In other words, we know that we see a strategy happening here if we see consistent set of behaviors as well as a consistent set of claims or statements about what they're doing. So if you think about a Venn diagram, what are policymakers saying, what are they doing, and where the two overlap is where you might say you can find the grand strategy.
Now we'll get to the Trump presidency in a minute, but in other words, you are arguing that Trump has a grand strategy, that he's not just randomly tweeting one moment to the next.
Well, both can be true. He could be randomly tweeting, and it may be that he has some coherent thing that he's doing. Or, a third option is that, and this is one argument that I make that maybe not everyone in this field is going to agree with, but I think sometimes you can inherit a grand strategy specifically as a leader of a country, in the sense that there are already a set of existing priorities and policies that are going to be very difficult for you to change. So Trump, and Obama had this issue too, George W. Bush before him as U.S. presidents, all of them talked about radically changing U.S. foreign policy, but they were all ultimately constrained by existing U.S. interests and commitments and that type of thing. So, in short, my argument is that Trump ends up looking like he has a strategy, whether he knows it or not, but that strategy is primarily informed by his nationalism. He has basically nationalist views of the world, and as a set of impulses or intuitions. And what he does is broadcast those to the world, and then he has people around him in his administration that are trying to fit all of that together, Trump's impulses, into some kind of coherent set of policies.
So would you argue that every world leader, no matter how incoherent, has a grand strategy to a certain degree?
Yeah, no, I would say yes and no. On the one hand, no, they don't. They may not have a coherent strategy, like you said, that they're pursuing, but that doesn't mean that in effect they're falling into a set of strategic behaviors, whether they know it or not. Um, you can think about it as a parent, for example. If you're raising your child and you say, I'm not going to make any decisions about how I'm raising this child, I'm just going to live. Well, that in itself is a kind of decision, right? And the child is going to come out a certain way. So implicitly, you've adopted a strategy. In a similar way, a leader might say, look, I'm not too concerned about the world or strategizing. I'm just responding to things as they arise and making judgment calls. Well, that is a strategic approach in a way to making those decisions. So I think the most ardent proponents of developing good strategy would say, look, you're going to fall into these patterns anyway. What you want to do is get ahead of it, recognize what your strategy is, and try to own it. I'll give you another example. I'm working with a student on studying Brazilian foreign policy under Bolsonaro right now versus Lula da Silva about a decade ago. And in that case, Lula had a very specific idea of how he was approaching the world. Bolsonaro is much vaguer on that. But that doesn't mean that Bolsonaro isn't falling into a set of patterns that we can observe about regarding Brazilian foreign policy and strategy.
That this kind of glides into the main topic of our course, foreign policy analysis. And one of the main questions that we've been pursuing throughout the course of the semester is to what degree foreign policy is predetermined by structural factors, the international system, a country's strategic culture, or even its regime type, or in how far individual leaders have an impact. And so my question to you would be, in how far, when it comes to grand strategy, what do you think is more important, or where do you see the balance between individual leaders and their characteristics and broader structural or cultural factors?
Right. Yeah, that's one of my favorite questions to push in class as well, because most people come with a set of assumptions about what really matters the most. And usually what we assume is, well, the people who are in office matter the most, their personalities or their prerogatives. But I'm not sure that that's exactly the case based on what I've been finding in my own studies. So you mentioned my dissertation, or I guess maybe we hadn't, but in my dissertation, I looked at George W. Bush and Jimmy Carter, compared them, and what I was looking for there was basically what is the single largest feedback that affected their decision making, particularly when they started in one direction and then ended up going in another direction, kind of admitting that they had failed in doing something new. And I have to say, I was surprised to find that in both of those cases, it was the structure of the international system and feedback coming from that system that affected them the most. Like, you can't deny, for example, like in Bush's case, that things were not going well in Iraq for the United States. So my general argument myself is, and what I've observed, like in the Trump administration, is that it's kind of invisible, but the structure of international politics is what sets the parameters, sets the playing field, if you will, for what can actually happen. And then second and related to that, and this is related to what I was saying a moment ago, would be, you know, the government's existing policies, priorities, commitments, and that type of thing in foreign policy. You don't start as a new leader with a blank slate. You start with a set of existing expectations that people have and so forth. Like when Trump first got elected, he was approached by a number of government leaders around the world. Normally, to be blunt, a more well-informed presidential candidate would know you don't talk to some of these leaders, or you work through certain channels in certain ways and work with the existing administration. Trump didn't know any of that, didn't really care about it, and was taking calls from different leaders and created some controversies. Now, you might think that illustrates, well, he's free to do things as he wants, but in reality, there was a lot of backlash, and he ended up having to backtrack on some of those discussions that he had with some of those world leaders because, you know, of existing expectations and so forth. So I tend to look at it as a set of hierarchies. The structure sets the parameters of what's possible in foreign policy, and then the specific existing foreign policies of the government constrain even more. And then you get to the leader, and within those parameters, leaders usually have a lot of latitude, particularly over time, right? With the other interesting thing I observed with Trump was that he did start out, as I expected, getting kind of pummeled back into behaving in the way that most Republicans, he's a Republican here in the United States, would behave on their foreign policy. But he actually, by the end of the 2 years that I looked at, was in a lot more control himself of the foreign policy of his administration. So the experience of the leader matters as well. As they grow into the role and experience the role, they have more and more leverage to shape that foreign policy. And then underneath that, public opinion, domestic politics, all of those matter. But in my kind of mental framework anyway, I tend to see leaders as kind of in between those two levels, and they're kind of constrained by the system in particular that they inherit.
Interesting. Now, looking back over the last few decades before Trump, do you think we could speak of a coherent U.S. grand strategy over time, or did it change more with each president?
This is one of my other big questions, and one that I haven't really grappled with as systematically as I would like, because it would take a lot of work, but I'm kind of working toward that. But the question is, another way to think about it is, if you charted out a foreign policy, like of U.S. foreign policy over time, does it move along on a certain trajectory during one administration, then stop and start in a completely different direction with each new administration? Or is it more of an arc moving across all of these administrations, and the administrations are kind of varying within that arc, right? They're, as I was saying, kind of constrained. So my argument is that, like, since the end of the Cold War, for example, U.S. foreign policy has been actually relatively stable, or U.S. grand strategy has been relatively stable. If we think about it in terms of the U.S. looks at its approach to the world as being defined by military power and military dominance, by economic interests and economic dominance, and then using political tools, international organizations, cooperation, that type of thing, as tools to get what it wants within that system. Now, you could say Bill Clinton had a very different grand strategy from George W. Bush, who was different from Obama, who, of course, was very different from Trump. But if you take a step back, historically, they're all kind of working within a similar set of interests and capabilities, if you're thinking about what is American strategy. Now, that said, Trump is more off to the side of that, and he challenges that, I think, more than any of those other prior leaders. And we could get into that discussion in more detail, but I would say that even in the Trump case, he's still constrained within a lot of those existing parameters. If he gets reelected, who knows? My other argument is that grand strategies for any country don't change dramatically unless you're in the middle of a major crisis. So something for the United States like World War II. That type of thing is when all of the old assumptions are thrown out. Economic interests, security interests, all those things get rearranged, make decisions, and move forward in a new way. If we paired what's going on now with maybe a security crisis for the United States, and somebody like Trump, who has a very different idea of U.S. foreign policy than his predecessors, you might have the recipe for a radical re-engineering of U.S. grand strategy. But we'll see. We could just as easily say this crisis could unfold in a way that everybody is affected equally, and you end up with not much change, or Trump gets thrown out of office, in the election this year, and then we start over.
That would be very interesting from a scholarly perspective, perhaps less interesting from a experiential, personal perspective. Well, specifically, how would you say Trump is continuing the previous grand strategy that has characterized American foreign policy? And in which way is he a departure?
Right. So the most obvious way that he's continuing is his spending on military capabilities. He talked a lot about withdrawing from certain places like Afghanistan, but he hasn't actually done a lot of that, right? Not nearly to the degree that he talked about. I mean, there has been some winding down, and there was peace talks in Afghanistan last year. There seems to be a deal, that's constantly on the bubble, ready to come through. But it's going to be difficult even in that case, for Trump to just simply pull out all of the U.S. capabilities there because of the long-standing commitment. More generally, since he's a nationalist, he's very interested in maintaining U.S. power and prestige around the world, even if he's less interested in maintaining military bases everywhere around the world. So, like in that particular case, you see some variation at the margins, but he's still consistent with that post-Cold War commitment that the U.S. adopted of maintaining military dominance around the world. Economically, Trump is as a sort of former businessman, or he styles himself as a former businessman. We could talk about the degree that was really why he's successful, but that is something that is important to him, and the people he has appointed as well is listening to the business community. Their interests haven't changed that much. Now, the current oil situation may, change some of those type calculations, but overall, the U.S. interest in free trade around the world, in financial investments and other types, in maintaining the U.S. dollar as a dominant currency, all those types of things are going to remain basically the same for Trump. Where you see the biggest difference is his approach to international organizations. He really has no use for them, and really doesn't care if they exist or not, like the United Nations. So, but even in those cases, it's difficult for him to just get rid of them. I think in the current crisis, you see, for example, Trump really wanted to blame the World Health Organization, the WHO, for basically not stopping the COVID-19 spread. I mean, the reality is there are some issues with the WHO, particularly as they relate to China, at least from the US perspective. Trump is playing that up, and he's decided to stop funding the World Health Organization. But that's not as if the US is suddenly going to pull out from all support of public health around the world, for example, or totally pull out of the UN. So Trump has some flexibility on the margins there. But my argument would be, when you look at the broad strokes, he styles himself and is, I think, rhetorically very different from his predecessors, but he hasn't actually achieved a new strategic trajectory yet.
Now, in the book, you talk about Trump's foreign policy vision, and I think you call it at one point global nationalism, at another point you call it arch nationalism, I think, referring to other scholars as well. And then you talk about many of his advisors, particularly at the beginning of his administration, which you refer to as, I think, principled realists, yes? And you sort of talk about the tension between them. Can you just talk a little bit more about and how far Trump was able to sort of put his own vision forward, and how far he was constrained by what we can call the foreign policy establishment?
Right. Yeah, I think this is a fascinating story, and it's a good illustration of the types of things, that you're studying in your class, for example. It's a good case study of foreign policy analysis. So, my expectation when Trump got elected is that he would spin out all this rhetoric, but he would have to appoint more conventional Republicans, more conventional foreign policy professionals, and those people would end up basically forcing him to come back to a more standard line. That looked to be the case early on. These people started talking about what they called principled realism. Their argument was, we're not going to be as internationalist or cosmopolitan as the Obama administration, but on the other hand, we recognize that the United States has a role to play in the world, or we want to play a role in the world. We want to shape global interests in our direction. So they appealed to realism in a very general sense as their basic framework, but also it was called principled realism because they also wanted to include certain U.S. prerogatives, like talking about spreading democracy around the world and that type of thing. Now, so that was a very conventional way for conservatives in the United States to think about foreign policy. Trump also appointed a set of people, most notably Steve Bannon, who only lasted about 6 months in the White House, and others who were very explicitly nationalist in their outlook. Now, how does that differ from realism? For nationalists, the main focus is not so much on power as keeping your country protected and pure, if you will, or making sure that you are safe and not, in this case, not corrupted by too many immigrants was one of the major issues, not corrupted by too many political alliances around the world, making sure you're getting your fair deal out of whatever alliances that you're a part of. So they treated European alliances, Arab alliances, Asian alliances, all in kind of the same way, not prioritizing any of them, but saying, look, if we're not getting a good deal out of this, we'll leave. And we don't care what your record on democracy is or anything like that, or what your, what historically your relationship with us has been. So those nationalists looked at the world in a little different way than the principled realists. And they just did not get along very well. Now, Trump himself, his instincts, as I've said, are more nationalist. In his view, every government should just take care of itself and focus on its own sovereignty, and then you cooperate a little bit as is helpful, and end of story, right? Realists recognize that you're in a system, and you have to compete in that system, whether you like it or not. And so there was the divergence became pretty clear as they began to write the National Security Strategy, which is a document that is required by Congress for the U.S. government to produce every 4 years. That is as close as you get to a statement on grand strategy that you can find in the U.S. government. So the idea of this principled realism you'll find, and I think it's the 2017 National Security Strategy, but by the following year in 2018, it's basically vanished as a concept in the administration. So what happened was, on the one hand, the more extreme nationalists in Trump's administration ended up getting drummed out over time. They just did not fit in. They would cause too many problems for Trump politically and that type of thing. But Trump also started to get rid of the more conventional thinkers as well. By the end, Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis is one of the last of those voices. Mattis was, I think you could say, an internationalist. As I point out in the book, it's kind of remarkable. Trump says, actually, Matt, in an interview, Mattis, he's kind of a Democrat, right? He's kind of my enemy because he sees the world in these internationalist terms, and I just don't. So Mattis ends up resigning over some decisions that Trump makes regarding Syria. We don't need to get into the details, but the point is, by the end, the nationalists are ascendant, but it's a different set of people. What you end up having is Trump appointing people like Pompeo, Mike Pompeo, who's still the Secretary of State, and others who are committed to Trump and they're hardliners. And for Trump, that's good enough, right? Trump has a more articulated view of the world now. So what we see is a more consistent nationalism, and the principled realists slowly lost out because they didn't have the favor of the president at the end of the day. It was kind of a long story, but hopefully, illustrative of the dynamics here.
And for those who want to know more about it, they need to go get your book. I imagine Mattis would have been surprised to hear that he was a Democrat.
Right.
First time in his life. I was going to ask a question related to our foreign policy analysis class, but I think in the interest of time, we'll stick more closely to your book so that we have a bit more time to discuss it. Now, grand strategy, I think the way you describe it sits sort of, when you talk about the Venn diagram, sort of at the overlap between what policymakers say and what they actually ended up doing. In that regard, Trump is always quite eager to trump his successes. So I wanted to know, based on his own metric, what would you say was one example of an area where Trump was successful according to his own metric and his own expectations? And what was one area where you think he fell quite short of his own expectations?
Right. Overall, his metric was to get the U.S. less involved around the world in all kinds of commitments that it was already in. And in particular, he wanted to renegotiate a lot of trade deals to get, better, more favorable arrangements. And along the way, what he wanted in his administration, as I was saying, was to promote this more nationalist view of international politics. In general, I would say that he did change the tenor of discussion, of international politics for a lot of governments around the world. He provided a cover for, more nationalist rhetoric for leaders around the world. Although that's kind of a side effect, of his agenda. He started a trade war with China, for example, in order to, again, get radically changed trade arrangements with China. So in a general sense, he has achieved some of the basic agendas, particularly on trade, in the sense that he got it on the menu, right? He got people talking about it. Other prior administrations were basically afraid to even, seriously challenge China. They would shake their finger and say, "We don't like what you're doing with us," and that type of thing. Trump was more direct and more willing to take a hit, like with the trade war, in order to try to compel the Chinese to change their trade arrangements with the U.S. and with other governments. But on the flip side, he hasn't really locked down any of those successes either. He's kind of opened the can of worms, as we say here, but he hasn't really successfully closed out in any of these things that he has initiated. So on trade, for example, before the pandemic really got going for everybody around the world, they were talking a little bit about, this is a great opportunity, we can hammer China on economics, but then everybody else got hit as well. So kind of froze that whole discussion to some extent. It hasn't gone away, but over almost 4 years now, they haven't actually gotten any serious trade deals that radically alter that situation. So that's one example. Another might be, as I was mentioning, on like Afghanistan, for example. Trump said, we're going to get out, we're going to solve it and be done. And as it has for so long, it just continues to move forward, and in different ways. So, and one other good example, I think, is Trump's relationship with Kim Jong-un in North Korea. Trump said, I'm going to talk to him. I can make a deal with him. I'm a deal maker, and we'll make sure that North Korea stops developing nuclear weapons. Well, he threatens Kim Jong-un in 2017, calls him Rocket Man. I was getting press interviews, people wondering what's going to happen. Are we going to start a war? Months later, he says they announced they're going to actually meet in a summit, which they do in Singapore. And not much comes out of it, though. Trump's goal, really, at the end of the day, was to meet in person with Kim Jong-un, shake his hand. This is before social distancing, I guess. And then, get the process started, because just the image of him shaking his hand was kind of a win in his mind. I think if you asked him today, he would say, yeah, I made progress with North Korea. I think most people watching North Korea would say they didn't get much. If anything, Trump blew some of his leverage and didn't get anything. In fact, they met later then in Vietnam, I think in early 2019, and Trump basically had to walk away from the table because he realized Kim Jong-un was not giving anything up. So North Korea is a good discrete example of how grand strategy has been unfolding for Trump. He totally changes the discussion. He's willing to do things that others weren't. But part of the reason he was willing to do those things is that he's not really gaming out, 2 or 3 steps ahead. He's leaping, and sometimes that can benefit you, but he's not closing any of these deals as he had promised.
Now, you make it very clear in your book that your emphasis is an empirical analysis of grand strategy, not a book full of policy proposals. And we political scientists are generally uncomfortable, showing our cards too much, well, generally speaking. But let me pose you this question, which I guess, Woodrow Wilson, I think, was the last political scientist to also be president. But what would a U.S. grand strategy look like with President Shively at the helm?
Yeah, that's a tough one in a way. In some way, I'll tell you. Probably the realistic answer is I'd probably end up like Obama in the sense that he was over-intellectualized everything and talked a lot and then thought about things too much, instead of taking some of those leaps that Trump is taking. But ideally, I'm a little less pessimistic than a lot of my colleagues and others who study U.S. foreign policy about what we'll call the liberal international order. It has been dying for years, ever since George W. Bush, and Trump was supposed to be the final nail in the coffin. And I know that approach to the world tends to come with, the U.S. asserting itself sometimes uncomfortably or inappropriately on other governments. But on balance, I think it's just something that needs to be revised. Now, let me pause here and explain what I mean. In my view, U.S. foreign policy has been relatively stable within the parameters I've been talking about since the end of World War II, or since maybe we'll say the late 1940s. An emphasis on maintaining stability, having a deterrent military power, not necessarily always using it, promoting free trade and political integration, those types of things around the world, while at the same time trying to respect government's sovereignty and prerogatives. Now, the first thing most people think when you say that is, well, what about all these exceptions, right? U.S. interventionism around the world, all those types of things. And I think that's a fair discussion. But my general point is, in a world defined by power, but not only by power, the powerful governments have to make decisions about how they're going to wield that power. They can pull away, they can defer that to others, or they can try to use that power in a way that at least tries to maximize what's best for everybody. There are going to be exceptions and so forth. To put it in another way, imagine the U.S. declines dramatically and China rises to the level that the U.S. is right now. What does that world look like? I don't know for sure. Maybe it's preferable for some governments around the world. But I think on balance, you would want the Chinese constrained by the rules and the expectations that the U.S. has set up, even in the breach sometimes over these decades. So if I was president, President Shively would probably, I don't know. It's tough because most of these get defined in, well, how would you approach this country? How would you approach that issue and so forth? But in general terms, I'm trying to think, what's my slogan?
Maybe we're starting something here. Who knows?
Yeah, first among equals or something like that. I had my wife's cousin, it lives in Japan, and her husband told me one time that he grew up in the U.S., that he thought that he liked that the United States was a leader, but the U.S. wasn't exceptional or better than anybody else. It just could lead in a way that nobody else could, in a more collaborative kind of way, at its best, right? At its worst, it's just as bad as any other government. And I've always thought that was a good way to think about it. So as a grand strategy, that might look like a cooperative world order, admitting that power matters and continuing to maintain that, but being aggressive about revising and updating diplomatic relationships around the world, international organizations, and that type of thing.
So essentially, you would say that a world, even with American hypocrisy, in other words, where the actions don't measure up with the principles, it's still preferable to a world where the essentially goes in Trump's desired direction, where it steps back and lets sort of other people take care of their own business.
Yeah. If you think about the Chinese approach to the world, the Russian approach, and so forth, and none of these other governments, their view is, look, let's all be honest. There are no ideas, there are no ideals, there are no principles. There's just interests, right? Now that seems sensible, but I think if you look at the long-term history of international relations, that spirals into catastrophic conflict more than once, right, for more than one government over the last 200 years. So I would be leery about just cutting straight to the case and saying, look, it's just about power and self-interest, end of story. At least if you are a hypocrite, you know that principles matter to some degree. The famous political scientist Samuel Huntington once wrote that America is a disappointment, but it's only a disappointment because it's a hope, right? It sets out a set of expectations. It fails to meet them often, but at least that approach points us in some direction.
Well, I think we had a whole other set of questions, but I think we're getting into our old mode of sitting and chatting, which is nice. It's great to reconnect. But I think this was a nice overview and a nice, I think, taste of what you've written about, and hopefully it will stir some more interest in your book and in the subject matter.
Good.
So thank you very much.